My name is Tim Carter. This is the Apologetic and Outreach Ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas. We are tabulating our, summary data and learning vast amounts from the feedback which we retain on public platforms so people can review all the comments and with us notice the reactions, the volatile, emotional, outrageous, sometimes nature of the reactions. But the psychology behind IamKorne.org and the psychology behind apologetics itself seem to be bigger than the process of apologetics. It finds itself, as we will, a companion to our hermeneutics. We had a hermeneutics professor, a very well-renowned, famous professor of the Missionary Baptist Seminary, Dr. John Penn. He also taught pastoral counseling. Used a very advanced textbook, very large textbook, and encouraged us to study the field of psychology, reminding us that it was developed by the theologian, the professor, Harvard professor William James, and it is actually a Bible-based subject, such as mathematics, calculus, physics, chemistry were all invented, developed by theologians. So since theology was the field from which the fields of science sprang, and theology came from the English translation that was translated by the Baptist William Tyndale, we effectively understand Western civilization today. So the psychology of understanding why we need hermeneutics, for example, which would then produce an apologetics that would not be so skewed that its bias is toward a pre-understanding. So what is it about psychology, as I'm now attending personally Louisiana Baptist University? They have an outstanding psychology program. It's a lot of it is all Bible-based, of course, but we learn about the secular expressions, the humanistic versions of psychology, and we are aware of those. But just speaking of some of the things that we can learn and have learned, and we're encouraged to learn while at the Missionary Baptist Seminary, and now I'm being encouraged by Dr. Mark Crook through the Louisiana Baptist University. He's very encouraging, contacts students, prayed with me before, contacts me, lets me know he's praying for me, and I'm very grateful for that encouragement. So as we begin to use this data from this platform that has now gone to over 150 countries, the data is quite remarkable. It's almost typical what we can expect. But when you hear about the physiology of the brain and how the thalamus receives information or stimuli, and some of it goes to the neocortex, that thinking part, we call it the thinking brain. A lot of it goes to the hippocampus, where experiences are recorded. Well, that's where we keep the information, but then it can go to the amygdala, which that mechanism, if it sees a match with the stimuli in the hippocampus, it will trigger and notify what's called HPA, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, keyword adrenaline, and what that does is cause us to react before our thinking brain engages. And it has good qualities. That is, it could save our life if we are in harm's way. Let's say some type of vehicle is approaching and the amygdala sees it, matches it with danger, triggers the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and we move before we even realize, was it a car or a truck? Our brain just hadn't quite caught up. Well, on the bad side, or the negative side, or the regrettable side, it appears that when people are engaged and presented truth, for example, from the scriptures, let's say, for example, we find that somehow their amygdala sends information to the HPA, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and causes them to react, whether it's fight, flight, or freeze. And often we see people verbally fighting and contending contentiously when we aren't in the argument with them. We're simply presenting what can be known. We're using language to maintain objectivity, grammar, syntax, etymology, inflectional morphemes, things that are really quite distinct from the interpreter, quite separate from the apologist, and quite removed from the psychology of our instinctive aspects that can be aroused quite quickly through the amygdala and that adrenal axis. So as Dr. John Penn has taught us, the Bible's synthetic, it's a synthesis. And people either will approach others because of biases and that all those experiences in their hippocampus. And with adrenaline flowing, they'll just justify themselves and proof text and process the Bible into supporting text for their views. Well, this is where contention comes from. For example, free will, for example. Not that I will talk about free will, but it's a perfect example. Because someone reacts, when you just say the word, you might have reacted right now. Some people just say, yes, the Bible teaches free will, and they put all their energy into yes. Another person says, no, it does not. They place all that emotion, that energy, and literally the thinking brain is never engaged or called upon. They never necessarily even use their mind to serve God. Romans 7, where we are said to be as those who are children of God, we serve God with our minds. We serve God with all of our mind. And it's actually an intellectual calling for a child of God. So it would be rare when you come upon someone, when you talk about the phrase free will, that then you might find someone that says compatibilism. They might have embraced some type of David Hume philosophy, atheistic philosophy, or an ever-growing, expanding, relative libertarian philosophy of free will. But we haven't found anyone who defined it from the Bible. That is the oldest definition, agent causation, which is actually in the biblical Hebrew, according to the certain causative stems embedded in the language that are aspects of the language according to inflectional morphemes. So if we were just looking at that, we would understand the proper relationship of a subject to the action, and we wouldn't have to ask questions about an abstract concept. But for example, where I pastor several years ago, people who seem to be taking privileges with their conduct and become to be quite loose in their conversations began to, I suppose, speak in a diminutive manner toward others. And a person who had commandeered the position of a preacher and another who had commandeered a position of a deacon were somewhat in a clash, if you will. And I noticed the conversation was somewhat strident, a little somewhat vitriol, and so I just happened upon him. I said, well, they were talking about free will. One saying yes, one saying no, and neither of them knew really what the other was saying. So I asked, are you all speaking of libertarian or compatibilistic forms of free will? Well, it occurred to them not only did they not know, but they realized they did not know that they didn't even know what they were talking about. It was just that they had ample adrenaline because of the amygdala, and that adrenaline flow continued to reinforce that experience in the hippocampus, which matched with them. It was a war going on between their ears, and now they were venting it toward each other. Well, when I asked the question, it returned them to the neocortex. The question engaged the cognitive side. They began to think for a moment, but it occurred to them they had no thoughts about it. And the idea of, let's say, point number 4 in Dr. John Penn's historical holistic hermeneutic process, define your term. Well, not just define it, but define it from the Bible. Don't just take even some silly Bible dictionary necessarily. Look the words up, find out if there's something there in the language, check that out, check the syntax, check the grammar, etymology, and the inflectional morphemes. So we were taught include everything in a holistic approach. So the feedback is saying that numerous things seem to be just totally bypassing our brain, our thinking part. So I'm not ready to say that everyone that is so contentious would be outside of the population that's regenerated, but they certainly are still behaving like people who've never had an experience of being brought to life unto God through Jesus Christ. For example, the latest one, the most novel one that had reached its zenith, someone said they were a young earther. Another person started saying they were an old earther. Well, it appeared that all they could do from the viewpoint of the amygdala, it was just saying, look, we recognize this as an either-orism. So adrenaline was provided by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The amygdala called for it, and it brought the fight in full fury. But because of the neocortex, the thinking brain, and then because there was a characterological problem here, we didn't see fruit of spirit, we didn't see love and joy and peace, patience, endurance, gentleness, goodness, meekness, temperance, and faith. That is, we didn't see those presented as characteristics of a person that would then prompt them, unlike fight, flight, or freeze, to faith, to support a brother's point of view, to support collaborative learning and collective reasoning, which we were trained in this in the Missionary Baptist Seminary. And I consider the Missionary Baptist Seminary in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Harvard of seminaries. Now, that's not my fault. That's their fault that they were so much driven to be a learning organization where student schemas were shaken, your pre-understandings that we all brought to the school were challenged. All of the primers we had been primed according to, religious primers and religious primes, and all the traditions of men that we all carried with us, some more, some less. We had all diverse professors, subject matter experts, one in linguistics, grammar, Hebrew, Greek, other in hermeneutics, counseling, Bible history, survey. We had scholars from diverse fields of training, legal backgrounds, law backgrounds, liberal art backgrounds, engineering backgrounds. So that was quite an array, if you will, an ensemble, if you will, of subject matter experts. So that when young and old was presented to me personally, and then to friends of mine, colleagues, if you will, in the field of apologetics, specifically hermeneutics that leads to a better apologetic, we noticed, especially I went all the way back to Dr. John Penn, a throwback, our professor who still works with the students, who's still active helping us and still somewhat challenges us and resources us. But he said if we had a mathematical formula, all this could be worked out. So I went back to the drawing board because he was encouraging me to think holistically and include all the data. Well, he had mentioned one day is like 1,000 years, and he talked about lunar years rather than solar years. So I was not interested in my amygdala nor the communication it was having with my hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. I was engaged mentally as a student according to the character traits of one who is alive unto God through Christ Jesus, and was following the encouragement and prompts by my professor, and went back and gathered it, and we discovered there's absolutely a correlation. We also discovered, and we're all reminded collectively as we discuss these things and share them with one another as professional colleagues in the practice of hermeneutics and the aim of apologetics, and remembering the psychology, the professionalism of it, and then me having the privilege of participating under the guidance of Dr. Mark Crook and the structure of the curriculum thus far taken at Louisiana Baptist. It all came into this wonderful outcome, and I'm no longer surprised anymore. Someone says Calvinism, Arminianism, I just say, well, they're fallible religious constructs. We define, document, and disclose the fallible elements of each one, each point within one, pre, mid, or post-trib, whatever rapturism people are advocating. We evaluate each one, define, document, disclose any fallible elements within it. But we just don't find that very prevalent, if at all, among so many people, that in one of the most encouraging things I've ever participated in, some very specialized, that is, some subject matter experts in the field of hermeneutics, Bible interpretation, Bible study, exposition, was the American Baptist Association Preachers Forum, the ABA Preachers Forum. Now, you have to be trained before you sustain very long on there, because several from a novice view will come on there and ambush you, and others from, let's say, not quite a novice but not quite a subject matter expert will presume to know much and begin to, give you a lot more feedback than you're prepared for. But overall, the subject matter experts in that forum provide a collaborative context where we have found true collaborative reasoning taking place, and the higher ordered learners who have more high functioning definitions, for example, of church than an abstract concept, soteriology rather than the abstract absurd assertion like regeneration precedes faith. These men have actually, in their history and labor and word and doctrine, have deconstructed such abstractions and shown what the text actually says and what it's actually been proven to demonstrate throughout 2,000 years of the New Testament church's history. So with that in mind, this is just somewhat a little bit about the psychology behind IamCorne.org and why we don't fight, and we don't flee, and we don't just freeze. And a lot of people out there regrettably just say they don't have anything to do with religion, and they don't like to see the banter and the arguments. It's because those who cause such a disconcerted environment win. If they had a definition for their terms, they would say it. If they knew more about free will, they wouldn't just yell yes or no, literally raise their voices. If they knew about the relationship of something created always being always being older than the time it's existed. Adam was just a few hours old, and yet Christians are still very calmly discussing whether or not he was 21 or 33 and a half. And there's no banter, there's no accusations that you don't believe the Bible. And I've never seen anyone get up and walk out of a Bible class saying, well, I believe in the 12-hour-year-old Adam, or 12 hours old Adam, and as opposed to a 33-and-a-half-year-old. So some of the silliness out there wasn't silly at the time it was said. It was coming from a very strident, very powerful thing that is occurring in the brain, the untrained mind, the person without a spirit of Christ and the spirit of a learner, and without the character to be taught. Some people can lash out in some of the most harsh manners. So this is just to give you the psychology as to why, no matter what the data says, whatever people say, our neocortex, our brain, thinking brain, is triggered first. We're engaged in thinking. What's triggered for us as students of the Scriptures, those who've grown upwardly to the full measure of the stature and gone on unto completion and know what it is to be transformed by the renovation of our minds, we're triggered to think first. And then we think and follow the scripts, and we understand what God's teaching us, and then we share that with our fellow man. So it's been a great journey. It's been difficult on people who have their thinking brain overridden. They don't understand why. But hopefully this will help you and encourage you. Don't be too hard on others unless you're willing to first be that difficult on yourself. And one thing I'll never forget is the pastors of the professors at the seminary always say you won't be disappointing others near as much once you are disappointed in yourself. And once you come to grips with who you are and know that your biggest problem is between your ears and between you and yourself, then you won't be nearly as inclined to lash out at others, but rather you'll grow into that person that can help others and make a difference. So have a blessed day and enjoy this information.